Hello, and the purpose of this video is to critically review the article from the Mormon Worker called An Introduction to Mormon Anarchism. So, an introduction to Mormon Anarchism, and it is hosted in the Mormon Worker WordPress weblog. And I will put a link in the description to both the article and the weblog. But the Mormon Worker is dedicated to promoting Mormonism, anarchism, and pacifism. Okay, so I'm just going to critically review. I'm not going to review the whole article, of course, because it's very, very long. It's a term paper, actually. But I am going to definitely cover as much of it as possible. Okay, so I'm going to try to skip around to try to cover as much as possible. But yeah, anyhow, let's see. And the article is called An Introduction to Mormon Anarchism. And it is written by William Van Wagenen, right? And he says, in this paper, I wish to show that the consistent application of the principles expounded in Mormon scripture should lead a person to become an anarchist. In other words, every Mormon should look forward to the abolition of government and the building of a socialist society based on free association and mutual cooperation. Attempting to argue such a case may seem perplexing, given the generally pro-capitalist, pro-government, pro-war stance of many American Mormons today. Okay. Right. So anarchism is defined in terms of Mormon anarchism as abolition of government and the building of a socialist society based on free association and mutual cooperation. Okay. So a socialist society based upon free association and mutual cooperation. So it's a sort of association and mutualism. Not quite the anarcho-syndicalist voluntary association of cooperative groups, but aiming in that direction. And they talk about government, but not the state. Government is not the same as state. Government are the people who administer the state, whereas the state itself is a body, an assembly, an ensemble of institutions. And the basis of the state, according to Karl Marx, of course, is that the essence of the state is bodies of armed men, right? So, but yeah, anyways, it's not enough to just overthrow the government. You have to get rid of the state in order to be able to have a socialist society based on free association and mutual cooperation, which is the Mormon anarchist alternative to the current state. Okay, by arguing that every Mormon should be an anarchist, I am not attempting to imply that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is currently in a state of apostasy, because its membership does not openly strive for the establishment of an anarchist society. Governments and capitalist economies constitute the reality in which Mormons must live, making some degree of cooperation with government necessary for the Mormon Church to simply exist and evangelize. In the decades following the founding of the Mormon religion in 1830, the federal and state authorities directly threatened the church's existence various times in the form of imprisonments, expulsions, land confiscations, and so forth. I mean, Joseph Smith was lynched. He was executed. He was executed by a lynch mob. The most notorious example of this came in 1838, when the then governor of Missouri, Lilburn Boggs, issued an executive decree stating, quote, "The Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace," end quote. Even after the Mormons finally found a safe haven in the deserts of Utah, the U.S. government threatened the existence of the church several times. In 1856, President Buchanan sent 2,500 soldiers to Utah to put down the, quote, "Mormon rebellion," end quote, while the entire leadership of the church was at one time either imprisoned or forced into hiding by federal authorities due to the Mormon practice of polygamy. As a result of such persecution, it was necessary for Mormons to come to some kind of accommodation with the state. Further, it is the responsibility of Mormons to care and provide for their families, making participation in capitalist economies largely unavoidable. Okay? Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, Mormons were seen as heretics by the religious establishment, rightfully so, because, they introduced the Book of Mormon into the Christian narrative. and that was considered heretical and anathema to Christendom, right? Yeah, the restorationist element of Mormonism was the reason why they lynched Joseph Smith. In the same, for example, and I see Joseph Smith in the same light as I see Michael Servetus, for example, who was burnt at the stake in Geneva in 1553 because he wrote a book, partly because he wrote a book called De Trinitatis Erroribus, the errors of the Trinity. So he rejected the Trinity and he was burnt at the stake. So that's another example of that type of martyrdom. What is necessary to criticize regarding the current state of affairs, however, is that many Mormons do not consider support for government and capitalism as necessary evils demanded by current conditions, but rather see capitalism and government as divinely inspired institutions, which Mormons are obliged to enthusiastically support and unquestioningly obey. Mormons thus find themselves supporting capitalism and government, and therefore exploitation, imperialism, jingoism, and militarism, considering these things inherent to their religion, despite the many resources within Mormon scripture advocating the contrary. It is important that Mormons not see establishment of capitalism and its above-mentioned offspring as the, quote, end of history, end quote, but rather look forward to the establishment of a society, an economic system in accordance with the principles contained in their own sacred writings. Okay. Well, this issue of Mormons thus find themselves supporting capitalism and government. Okay, capitalism. Is the United States is the United States a legitimate free market economy? Anarcho-capitalists would say no. Okay. I'm not going to comment on the United States because I'm not there, but I'm going to comment on Sweden. Is Sweden a legitimate free market? No. Sweden is a controlled market, right? Is a controlled market, can a controlled market be defined as capitalist? No, because for legitimate capitalism can only exist in the absence of the state. So legitimate capitalism necessitates the voluntary society. So you have a collection of sovereign individuals living in context of a voluntary society, in context of a pure free market where the state is absent. That is legitimate capitalism. So the system that exists in Utah or the United States is not real capitalism, but it is an economically exploitative. The American system is economically exploitative and oppressive. That is correct. It is definitely not a democracy, and it's definitely not a free market. All right, so that's definitely correct. So the Mormons who believe that they're supporting capitalism are actually deceiving themselves. They're not supporting capitalism. They're supporting another type of controlled market. But yeah, and again, in government is not really the main problem. Government is just the people who run the state. The problem is the state. Let's see. Oh, this chapter is interesting, and I'm going 8 minutes here. The political dominion of the state. Insight into the reason Mormonism, as well as Christianity generally, is inimical to the state and capitalism is revealed in Matthew 20:25. Jesus, speaking to his disciples about authority, says, quote, "Ye know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. But it shall not be so among you. But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister, and whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant." End quote. Note that there are two types of authority acknowledged here. One is characteristic of the Gentiles, while the other is characteristic of those who follow Jesus. The authority of the Gentiles is such that some men or women, quote, exercise dominion over others, end quote. This ostensibly is a reference to the authority of the Roman Empire, which ruled in Jesus' day. In other words, the authority of the Gentiles is the authority of the state. John Howard Yoder defines the state as, quote, the phenomenon that society is organized by the appeal to force as ultimate authority, end quote. As the sociologist Max Weber explained, if no social institution existed which knew the use of violence, then the concept of the state would be eliminated, and a condition would emerge that could be designated as anarchy in the specific sense of the word. Okay, so let's unpack this. Yeah. This is a very interesting approach. It's almost Marxist, almost Marxist. You know, yeah. The authority of the this is not quite Marxist. This is coming out from, this is a more social gospel argument, a radicalized social gospel exegesis. The authority of the Gentiles is such that some men or women, quote, exercise dominion over others. In case of Sweden, that would be the parliament, right? The professional, the class of professional politicians that inhabit the parliament. An oligarchy of men and women who exercise dominion over others, right? Or who arrogate themselves that power. Yeah. The authority of the Gentiles is the authority of the state, right? So, okay. Yeah. So you could say perhaps, yeah. But again, this clashes with Marxism in a way. Yeah. Okay. John Howard Yoder defines the state as, quote, the phenomenon that society is organized by the appeal to force as the ultimate authority. That is more closer to Marxism. In my personal perspective on the state, when it comes to the analysis of the state, I look at it more from the perspective of Karl Marx. Specifically, the definition of the state as bodies of armed men. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. It's not really, here they talk about, the Gentiles exercise as a group of an oligarchy of men and women who exercise dominion over others, right? That describes the Swedish parliament, right? But the Swedish parliament, the politicians in the Swedish parliament, they pass laws, right, among themselves. They pass the law, right? They rule, right? They command and rule, and they have legislative power. So they dictate what the other Swedish citizens can and cannot do, right, in the laws that they pass. So and they define, what rights the Swedish citizens have and what the Swedish citizens are entitled to get or not get. It's not quite like the bureaucrats, the bureaucracy, which decides. It's not quite the case as with the Soviet nomenclatura, as defined by Leon Trotsky, which is that the bureaucracy decides who gets what and who doesn't. It's not quite the same. The Swedish bureaucracies work the same way as the Soviet nomenclatura, but you have the added element of the political class, the professional politicians in the parliament who have the right to legislate. Now, the laws of the parliament and the rulings of the bureaucrats, mostly social democrat bureaucrats, of course, because in Sweden the social democrats are a state within a state. So the social democrats are penetrated everywhere. The bureaucracy, the armed forces, the police, everything is penetrated by social democrats, because they are the ones who founded, they are the ones who established the current version of the Swedish state. But anyhow, the rulings of the social democrat bureaucrats, the laws of the parliament, it's just words on paper, objectively speaking, there is no objective difference between a law and a Batman comic book, because they're both text, right? However, what gives the text of the law power as opposed to a Batman comic book is the fact that there is police, right? Armed men and women who will enforce that law through force and coercion, right? And that is the essence of the state. So that is how I see the state. I see the state more in Marxist terms of bodies of armed men, a sort of Marxist Trotskyist definition, more Marxist Trotskyist analysis of the state, where it is bodies of armed men, but also bureaucrats and politicians who decide who gets what and who doesn't, right? Yeah. And one of the founding principles of anarchism, well, not anarchism, but is that the old saying, the less law, the more freedom, and that is why you also could make an argument that Sweden is not really a democratic country, because this country, Sweden, is premised upon the premise of as much law as possible. Everything is regulated. So, yeah, Sweden is the opposite of the premise. Less law, more freedom. So, but yeah, So, John Howard Yoder defines the state as, quote, the phenomenon that society is organized by the appeal to force as ultimate authority. Yeah. And then you had Max Weber explaining that if no social institutions existed which knew the use of violence, then the concept of the state would be eliminated and a condition would emerge that could be designated as anarchy. All right. Okay. The author of this paper disagrees with Karl Marx. Mormon Anarchism disagrees with Karl Marx in this. Force is certainly not the normal or the only means of the state. Nobody says that. But force is a means specific to the state. Today, the relation between the state and violence is an especially intimate one. In the past, the most varied institutions have known the use of physical force as quite normal. Today, however, we have to say that a state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Right, so the issue of borders, right? Yeah, that's true. I mean, yeah, perhaps the Marxist definition of the state is too simplistic in that it simply boils down to bodies of armed men. There is a little bit more to it than that, such as borders, right? The state has to have, the state has the right, the state claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory, right? So yeah, that's correct. I mean, that's the case with all states. Right. Legitimate use of physical force, which is called law enforcement, right? Law enforcement. The concept of law enforcement admits to the Marxist definition of the state as bodies of armed men. However, there also need to be borders, right? And borders need to be policed, and threats to the border need to be eliminated, such as undocumented persons, etc., right? So, yeah. At this point in Sweden, they're not eliminating the undocumented with violence, right? I mean, if an undocumented person is captured, they're put in, I don't know what they do. Well, many of them end up in the immigrant detention, right? But obviously, when they transport you to immigrant detention, it's like armed men do it or whatever. Like the police are the ones who. The police don't take you there, but the police are the ones who like handle you first, and they're armed. So, I've been in immigrant detention 3 times, so I know how it works. And all 3 times I was put in a city jail for 3 days before being transferred to the detention center. So initially, it's armed men and women who handle you, in my experience. So, yeah. But I was never subjected to violence. None of those policemen ever did anything violent towards me. In fact, the 3rd time that I was in detention, one of the policemen was a Pentecostal, and I asked him, hey, can I have my Bible? And he said, yeah, but I have to check it first. And then he checked it, and he said, you can have it. So he let me have the Bible in the cell, you know? So that's nice. So no, quite the contrary. I wasn't really mistreated by the police. I never have. But I mean, those policemen were armed, right? So, okay. Those who challenge the sovereignty of the state or who do not follow its laws will be forced to submit by violence. This may take the form of imprisonment, execution, or in the case of rebellions, counterinsurgency warfare. Because the state has an overwhelming advantage over its population in the capacity for violence, it is able to exist and retain power. The monopoly over weapons is, or something like that. Something about the monopoly over weapons. The monopoly over weapons possession, but in the United States they have the right to bear arms, the population. So I don't know. In Sweden, I don't think that exists. The right to bear arms. I don't think they have that. Not as explicit as the United States. Yeah, because for example, in the United States, it's written into the concept that a well-armed militia is necessary for the preservation of a free state. So that concept is perhaps premised upon the right to own a weapon, and then to associate with others who own a weapon and form a militia to protect your collective freedoms as you perceive them, perhaps. But then the problem is that the American government is very powerful. As, for example, what happened in Waco, Texas in 1993, the Branch Davidians were armed to the teeth, but the ATF and the FBI were more armed. So and eventually, obviously, the ATF and the FBI won the battle, and they incinerated the Branch Davidians. So even though they were armed to the teeth. So yeah. Okay, let's back up here. Okay, let's read this thing. I'm just going to read the whole thing. Okay, those who challenge the sovereignty of the state or who do not follow its laws will be forced to submit by violence. This may take the form of imprisonment, execution, or in the case of rebellions, counterinsurgency warfare. Because the state has an overwhelming advantage over its population in the capacity for violence, it is able to exist and retain power. Sovereignty is lost as soon as this advantage in violence can no longer be maintained. Thus, the political and military leadership of any state uses violence and the threats of violence to, quote, exercise dominion over others. Of course, the violence necessary to maintain sovereignty can be reduced when a state can secure the consent of the masses it governs, making representative political systems as well as the use of propaganda useful in perpetuating the acceptance of the state's existence. Violence, however, continues to constitute the foundation of the state's ability to exist and is what distinguishes the state from other social institutions seeking to achieve similar goals. I see. So a private entity, a private non-state actor trying to achieve a political goal is not the same as the state, of course, because a private political entity is not is not a state. Even in there's an ambiguity here. The Colombian FARC. The Colombian FARC was recognized by the United Nations as a belligerent, but not as a state in the territory it controlled, even though the Colombian FARC did set up institutions in the territories it controlled, and it set up a system of taxation, etc. Okay, yeah. Right. The political and military leadership of any state uses violence as the threat of violence to exercise dominion over others. Eminent domain, right? The state arrogates to itself the right of eminent domain. Mussolini defines fascism as the dictatorship of the state over the cooperative mass. And of course, as Mussolini conceptualized the dictatorship of the state was the anarchy of state power, right? In other words, a radical fascism, as Mussolini conceptualized it, was a radical expression of absolute eminent domain and state power, the anarchy of state power. In that context, the individual was to be subsumed into the cooperative mass, which was going to be directed by the state. So, yeah. So, that is Mussolini's theory of fascism, right? Yeah. Of course, the violence necessary to maintain sovereignty can be reduced when the state can secure the consent of the masses it governs. In other words, you create the illusion of democratic government, and then the state claims that it has a democratic mandate, right? Because there's an election every 4 years. The problem is that though the politicians being elected is the same people, because the politicians are professional. They're professionals. They're professionals who are not subject to recall, And for example, once they get elected to the parliament, they stay there for years and years and years, and you can't never get rid of them because there is no right to recall. There is no term limits, really. You know what I mean? You would need the right to recall and term limits to really make the parliament into a democratic entity. But of course, the parliament is never going to agree to that, because we were talking here about the Roman Senate. They would never agree to that. The idea that you could have recall in the Roman Senate is anathema, right? Yeah. Let's move on to economic. The economic dominion of capitalism. 24 minutes. Oh no. I'm gonna have to do a part 2. Okay. While the state allows some men and women to exercise political dominion over others, the capitalist mode of production allows men and women to exercise economic dominion over others. This stems from private rather than social ownership of the means of production, such as land, factories, natural resources, and so forth. When the means of production are owned privately by capitalists, workers have no means to support themselves and must sell their labor to the capitalists in order to survive. Because the capitalist is in a position of dominance over the worker, he can fire the worker and leave him without any resource to live. the capitalist is able to take the profits produced by the labor of the worker. Rather than paying the worker the dividends of the wealth produced by the worker's labor, the capitalist instead pays the worker a wage. This wage is not determined according to what the worker and his or her family need to survive, but rather according to the demands of the market. Wages fluctuate depending upon how many people are in need of work. The more people in need, the lower the wage a capitalist can pay, as he can replace any unsatisfied worker by another yet more desperate. In this way, a person's labor becomes a commodity to be purchased and sold, like oil or tin. The buying and selling of a person's labor resembles the way in which Africans were previously purchased and sold as slaves in the United States. A beautiful summary of Marxism. Beautiful summary of Marxist theory, right? I mean, they define, extraction of surplus value as very well defined here in plain terms. Beautiful language here. But let's be critical. Okay, yeah, private ownership of the means of production. All right, private ownership of the means of production. Does private ownership of the means of production exist in Sweden? Prima facie, yes, but in reality, the control of the capitalist over the said means of production is conditional in Sweden, because the state has absolute eminent domain. The state in Sweden can do whatever it wants. It can take whatever it wants. It can do whatever it wants. It has absolute eminent domain. So and again, we're talking here about a controlled market. It's not a real free market. It's a controlled market that is highly regulated and taxed. So the Swedish controlled market has produced 41 billionaires. Great. And I'm sure those billionaires are having a great time, enjoying their wealth. They're wealthy. They live in the illusion. They live in the matrix. In that they think that they're free, right? It's like Goethe said, none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who believe they're free. That's what I would say about those 41 billionaires. Because I'm sorry, their control over their assets and means of production, if they inside Sweden at least, within the jurisdiction of the Swedish state, is conditional. Because if push comes to shove and one of those 41 billionaires gets like crazy ideas about whatever, or doesn't toe the line, or like becomes, I don't know, non-productive in terms of the overall agenda of the Swedish capitalism or whatever, that person would probably be removed and his assets would be transferred to somebody else, or whatever. Kind of like what Putin did when Putin took over Russia. They were like, the oligarchs that supported him were fine, but the oligarchs that did not ended up, their assets were confiscated and they ended up in jail, right? And there's like the famous trial of the oligarchs. Like there was this famous trial of an oligarch in a cage in front of it was like a courtroom, and the oligarch was sitting in a cage with, like chains or whatever. The former oligarch, because Putin confiscated his assets, The Swedish state could do the same thing to one of these 41 billionaires if they ever do not toe the line. So whether these means of production in Sweden are really, So private ownership of the means of production in the Swedish control market is conditional. And by no means is there any social ownership of the means of production in Sweden. So there is no social ownership of any means of production in Sweden. So clearly Sweden is not a socialist country. And the welfare system does not make Sweden socialist. Or the fact that they have so-called free healthcare and free education. Relatively free, with caveats, right? So, the welfare system in Sweden exists to control the population, to buy loyalty, not to. And yeah, they'll say, oh, but we pay taxes. We pay for it. We pay taxes. You are forced to pay those taxes. Those taxes are confiscated from you by Skatteverket. Okay, you're not giving a choice to like pay the tax or not. You're forced. Your income is like taxed. A portion of your income at least is confiscated. Then there is sales taxes, value-added taxes, fuel taxes. In case you have a business, capital gain. There's taxes all over the place. So, whatever. Now, that the capitalist is able to take the profits produced by the labor of the worker, that is true in Sweden. I mean, Sweden, it also has, the working class in Sweden has a double burden. On the one hand, the worker in Sweden is taxed by the state, and then on top of that, their employer extracts surplus value. So the situation for the worker is doubly worse.